a certain sense of purpose. But I don't have innate creative talents. Renzo does, or maybe Frank Gehry, or Alvaro Siza. So in that sense, yeah, I feel a bit of a fake.
Hello, I'm Marcus Fairs, and I'm founder and editor-in-chief of Dezeen, the online architecture and design magazine. And this is our face-to-face podcast series where I sit down with leading architects and designers and talk about their lives and careers. In this episode, I speak to David Chipperfield, one of the world's most celebrated architects. Despite his success, he still suffers from imposter syndrome, describing himself as a sham. David grew up on a farm in Devon and originally dreamed of becoming a vet. But as he admits, he was a fairly hopeless student and realised he would never make it to medicine school. He later studied at the Architectural Association in London in the 1970s, where fellow student Zaha Hadid stood up for him during a particularly tough review. And David says that if she hadn't intervened, he would have failed his diploma. The AA in those days was a hotbed of architectural radicalism, yet David went in the other direction, building a career based on what he describes as good old-fashioned modernism. But despite the austerity of his work, David is a really warm person in private, as I've learned via several fun nights out with him over the years. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the interview with David Chipperfield. This episode is sponsored by Twinmotion, the real-time architectural visualization solution for creating stunning visuals and immersive experiences in seconds. Learn more at twinmotion.com. Hi David, good to see you again.
Good morning.
If you could just start off by explaining where we are. We're in your office here in just off the Strand in central London, but explain the setup you have here. How many people do you have and what happens here?
It sounds a bit grand. We have 4 offices, but really we have 2 main offices, London and Berlin. We're in the London office, and there's about 100 people, 90 people here. In Berlin, there's about 130 at the moment. In Milan, there's about 40. And Shanghai, well, they're all at home at the moment, but normally there's about 25.
And they're all at home because of the coronavirus?
Well, I think some of them went back yesterday. There's a sort of slightly strange consideration, which is the main office. It always used to be London, in a sense that London was, where everything emanated from. But I think over the years, I've tried to accept and, in a way, develop an idea that each office is sort of self-sufficient. The truth is, it's very difficult to transfer resources between one office and another. You're busy in one office and not so busy in the other. It sounds quite interesting. You could send 5 people over from London to Berlin or Berlin to London. The reality is it doesn't work that way. And also financially, you want each office to be independent. You don't want one office working really hard to subsidize the failures of the others. So they've tended to grow organizationally and to some degree, I would say, culturally, because working in Milan is just a million miles away from working in Berlin. And Berlin, different to London, the whole professional setup, the whole relationship to professional environment, and then I would even say the cultural environment, the type of work. We do have sort of 4 separate offices, and I'm the constant, I suppose.
So what about your time then? Do you divide your time between all the different offices, or are you based mostly in London? What does your average month look like?
Because we live in London, the children are in London, etc., I tend to be most in London. But I will be in Berlin 2 or 3 times a month, and normally for 3 or 4 days, and we have a place to live there. So I spend time between the London and Berlin offices in a very regular manner. And then once or twice a month, I also go to Milan. 3 or 4 times a year, I would go to Shanghai, which is a bit of an anomaly. I mean, that's much more difficult. But my sort of itinerary is rotating in this triangle between London, Berlin, and Milan. And at the moment, I'm spending quite a lot of time in Milan as well because of editing Domus.
You're the guest editor of Domus. Is that for a whole year?
For 1 year, yeah.
And how is journalism for you?
Well, I'm trying to do it as an architect as opposed to being a journalist. It sounds like I'm criticizing journalism, but I'm not really. I can't be a journalist, so I'm trying to do it very much from a very selfish point of view, using it as an opportunity to reflect on the profession.
And you were saying earlier that you've been doing interviews with architects, so tell us a little bit about who you've been speaking to and what you've been questioning them about.
I accepted to be editor for 1 year. Well, mostly because one increasingly feels that the challenges that are confronting us all, climate crisis and equally important, I think, crisis of growing social inequality. Yesterday we had in the news here a report saying that extreme social inequality and poverty is reducing life expectancy in Britain, in our own country, by 7 years. It's the first time in our history that we're going backwards. So social inequality is just as critical. Both of those issues the use of resources and the way we treat the natural environment, the way that we build or don't build community and society, which is one safety net for quality of life and therefore social quality. Both of those things architects are profoundly involved in. The things that we do affect both of those things. However, as a profession, we would put our hands up and say, yeah, but it's not really our fault individually. I mean, what can we do about it? So in that sense, we're a bit like everybody else is in this crisis. We're all becoming much more aware. We're all becoming much more sympathetic and concerned. And we'd like to think about adjusting our behavior in some way, being more careful about plastics, taking less flights. We're all scratching our heads trying to make some gesture, but we know that it's pretty thin in a sense. Well, it's not much different in the profession, that we know that we have to shift our perspective. But how do you do that in the middle of the process? How do you soaring off the legs of your chair that you're sitting on? It's not very easy just to find another chair. It's not very easy for us to say, we should be doing much more social housing. We should be really rethinking how we operate as professionals while we're keeping the bus running. We really have to redirect the bus while we're sitting on it. That's an incredibly difficult thing to do within practice, although we're talking about it a lot, as everybody is. I'm not convinced that putting some solar panels on a building or thinking about thermal envelope is really the issue. I think it's got to go back to big political decisions about planning, et cetera, et cetera. Domus is an opportunity for me to talk about these issues, as it were, from the position of practice, but outside of the professional constraints of running business. So I've used it, I'm trying to use it as a way of venting some of these concerns. And so the 10 issues are trying to look at these problems from the point of view of our own practice, from my studio outwards, to say, how do we as architects rise to this position? The 10 issues each have an agenda. The agenda doesn't include the whole magazine. It's like a very extended editorial. And then when I talk about built work, I'm trying to put the focus on the practice of architecture as much as the objects of architecture. Architectural magazines tend to show you one nice building after another, or in terms of Domus, for instance, one nice sofa or one nice lamp after another. And I just think this is slightly irrelevant. A new sofa is not going to change the world or deal with these issues. So I'm trying to do it that way. And one of the things I'm doing is taking 10 architects and letting them discuss the same topic.
And have there been any conclusions so far? Who have you spoken to? What is their take on this issue?
In terms of who I've spoken to, the first was Farshid Mosavi. The second was Peter Merkley in Zurich. The third was Francis Kere in Berlin. The fourth is going to be Renzo Piano. Well, I've just spoke to him. And the fifth is Joe Noero in South Africa. It's an interesting dialogue. And of course, some architects are more concerned about certain issues. Everybody is universally concerned with this duality architects have to deal with, which is, on the one hand, the physical thing. We all love making things. I mean, that's our stuff. Those are the words of our novel, or the words of our poetry, is columns and windows and floors and staircases and concrete and brick and wood. This is our stuff. We shouldn't underestimate the importance of making spaces, making buildings. But at the same time, of course, we want that stuff to be relevant within a concept of society. So we have these two concerns. All of us pivot around those problems. And of course, some people are engaged much more in one or the other. An architect like Peter Markley is very engaged in the physicality of architecture, I would say. But it would be simplistic to say he doesn't really care about societal anxieties. It's sort of interesting to see how we are all responding and thinking how to do this.
You mentioned before that these questions of climate change and social inequality are kind of political issues, and you suggested that the solution lies in policy. But do you think that as an architect and as a profession, you have any leverage at all? Can architects do anything to put the world back on a better course?
Well, this is our paradox, because if I was not an architect from the outside, I would say, but you guys are deeply involved in this. The construction industry uses a huge amount of resources, probably dwarfing most others, certainly dwarfing air travel and other things that we complain about. We are up to our elbows in the issue of building or not building good environments in terms of streets and squares and housing and community. And yet we somehow feel powerless. The question is, how do we get there and how do we get back? Because, after the war, I would say that architects were deeply involved in the planning of our cities, in planning communities, in planning housing. And gradually, this responsibility has eroded. The paradox is, I suppose, that probably the generation that can do most about it and are most nimble, are most affected, and have the least to lose are the young generation. And there are optimistic signs that the next generation is looking in a different way. And I'm spending a lot of my time encouraging them to do so. That I don't think conventional architectural practice can be maintained in the way. I mean, I don't think offices like mine are the model necessary for the future. Having said that, a young practice with 5 people just starting off with very good intentions doesn't have much political clout, whereas a practice like mine does have political clout. So we've got the most to lose in a way of cutting the legs off our chair, but at the same time, we probably have the most leverage, and therefore I feel that is a responsibility. I would say, I've been banging this drum for a few years. When I did the Architectural Biennale, my program was Common Ground, and that was an attempt to say, shouldn't we as a profession stop competing with each other, demonstrating in the context of a Biennale how mine is better than yours, how good I am compared to you, which is sort of how the Biennale tends to become. It's a sort of a car showroom of architectural talent. I asked every architect to say, your contribution to the Biennale should be about what you share with others. How does your work reflect? Submit something that demonstrates common concerns as opposed to individual concerns. And that's common concerns, A, within the profession, what binds us together, and secondly, with society. So as it were, the common ground that we should be sharing much more with a larger idea of society, and believe very strongly that we have to make ourselves more relevant. Very frustrating for architects to be building buildings within a predetermined planning environment where the master plan has been done for no real consideration apart from real estate investment. We sit in London and we know that the city has been designed and planned in the last 20 or 30 years by a laissez-faire attitude towards planning and an encouragement of investment. But where is the voice of the citizen? Except in protest. And then we have these ridiculous conflicts between a community and the investors. And everybody looks bad. Everybody comes out losing. The planners and the architects are somehow in this bloody sandwich. The result doesn't actually improve the city. It brings a lot of money because there's a lot of investment. But the question is, when you stand back and say, well, is this an intelligent process? And I really don't believe it is. But at the same time, very difficult to explain the complexities of these issues. We're not at a time when complexity is enjoyed. We like simple populist slogans. Do you want to improve your life? Vote Brexit. Simple things. Why do we have a housing crisis? Why has the housing crisis gone on so long? Because no one wants to touch it. It's too complicated, and everybody wants to blame somebody else. It's not that complicated. We need to build housing. It shouldn't be a housing crisis. It's a social problem. It's not about housing. It's about society. Housing is stuff that you build to make communities and to ensure quality of life. We've somehow made a sort of technical thing about delivery as if they're washing machines or something.
You mentioned earlier about how in the post-war generation architects did have power and were sort of helping to build a better society differently in this country. Tell us about your upbringing. Where did you grow up? What did you do? What were your aspirations? When did you first decide you wanted to be an architect? You grew up in London, is that right?
My first few years were in London because my father was an upholsterer. He had an upholstery company in Acton and Richmond. But he'd been evacuated during the war, and his dream was always to be a farmer. And he left school when he was 14 or 15, so he'd been working he built up this successful company doing upholstering furniture. And at some point, he just upped sticks and took us all down to Devon, and we lived on a farm miles from anywhere, near Dartmouth, and a hopeless farm with fields that were sloping about 45 degrees. He knew nothing about farming, and we spent, I would say, blissful childhood years in a very isolated rural community, working on the farm on weekends, and the eldest son, by the way, of a farm, which always means that you are part of the labor force, which is good and bad. So I grew up in a place called Slapton, walked to school, and there was a little primary school in a tiny little village close to the sea. My father realized that us kids would probably be slightly stuck if we stayed there, so I went to boarding school in Somerset. But the farm, I grew up on a farm. That was my life, and actually I wanted to be a vet. That was my dream, to be a vet. But I was not very good at school, fairly hopeless, I would say. But I was good at art, good at sports. I was sort of mentored by fantastic art teachers. I was just hopeless at the other. I was too lazy to do history and English and all that stuff. I was very encouraged by my art tutor, and also in boarding school, sport can become very important. I wasn't naturally good at sports, but I excelled as a runner, but mostly because I wanted to be better than anybody else. So those were my two lessons, I would say. And I suppose the other thing was the sort of crude lesson of running, that if I practiced enough, I trained enough, I could beat people.
You were a big fish in a small pond.
in a constrained environment like a boarding school, you've got to be good at something, otherwise you just drown.
And what was your distance that you ran?
400 and 800. I was county champion. I mean, I wasn't a great athlete. It was a lesson to realize that determination and commitment can compensate for a talent. And this is a discussion I have with my wife a lot, because I just say, I don't believe that I'm that talented as an architect. Probably I'm just a bit more persevering.
So how did your talent for art then develop into an interest in architecture?
Well, my art teacher was interested in architecture, and architecture became a sort of strong part of the course, and he encouraged me. And as it became clear that I wasn't going to get qualifications to study medicine, he encouraged me to think about applying for architecture school. And even then, I didn't really have the qualifications to get into university, so I got into art school. I got into Kingston School of Art with 2 rather weak A-levels and a bunch of O-levels and a reasonable portfolio. And so I went to Kingston School of Art, which was a great old art school. It was wonderful. Because in architectural training, you can either go the university course, or in those days especially, you could go to a number of art schools. And if you were in the art school, you were hanging around with painters, sculptors, graphic designers, fashion designers. And Kingston at that time was just a really good school.
So what era was that?
It was the middle of the 19th century, I think. It was like a few hundred years ago. It was 75, something like that, 74, or even earlier. No, it was 72. And I had a great teacher there, David Dunster. He thought I should go to the AA. I was doing very sort of conceptual things at Kingston. I have to say, it took me under his wing in a way and pushed me and encouraged me a lot and helped me apply for the AA. And so I transferred to the AA in my 3rd year. At which point, when I got to the AA, I was sort of shocked about how conceptual the AA was, and I became exceptionally conservative. And probably could have stayed at Kingston. And again, the AA in those days was really a fantastic school with amazing teachers.
So who was there at the same time as you at the AA? What was the mood like? What was happening there? It was just before the punk era, I guess, was it?
Well, the teachers were people like Rem, Leon Creer, David Shalev was my teacher with Sue Rogers. Then you had sort of Marxists like Brian Anson. Then you had Mark Fisher, people like that. Alvin Boyowski made a very polemic school, and each unit was doing exceptionally different things and very fascinating things. And so therefore you did the work in your unit, but your friends were in another unit. So, one of my best friends was in Leon Creer's unit. It was just interesting to see what they were up to, and somebody else was in Rem's unit and what they were doing. So it was a very good time at the AA. It was a very special period, although it was stressful as well, because it was dangerous, because in a way it was a sort of cacophony. It was a sort of Babel Tower, but incredibly stimulating. And, Zaha was a fellow student at that time, so we were that generation. In fact, Zaha stood up for me in the diploma review. She was a student representative, and I was about to be failed. And Zaha, till her dying days, reminded me that if it hadn't been for her, I would have failed, and that she got me my diploma.
So you got your diploma, and then what did you do after that?
In the last years of AA, I was taught by Patrick Hodgkinson, who, in a strange way, came back to teach because his practice was not doing well. He was, again, very supportive of me, and he got me a few interviews with people like Dennis Lasdon and with Douglas Stephen. Douglas Stephen was an architect who done some very interesting work, but also it had been a sort of a refuge for rather good people in his time. So Bob Maxwell had worked there and was still working there, in fact. It was in its closing chapter, so it wasn't a great office at that point. So I worked there for a while, and then I worked for Richard Rogers. I went in and worked on some competitions, and I worked on the Lloyd's competition, and it was a tiny office at that time. When we won Lloyd's, I left, and then Richard asked me to try and find a new office because they needed to move office. So I found a new office, and then with John Young, I was the project architect in designing the new office, so that was a nice experience. And then after that, I left, and then I went to work for Norman Foster, and then I worked on the BBC competition. Those were 2 really important competitions in London over those years, Lloyd's and BBC, and I worked on the winning team on both. When we won, I had decided I was already going to leave Norman, so I was a sort of part-time worker. And at the celebration party for the competition, I went to Norman, I thanked him, and I said that now I'm leaving, but thank you so much for this good experience. And then he said, no, you can't leave because you know too much about the project. And so he sort of asked me to stay on, so I stayed on for a couple of years and worked on BBC. And then when I could feel that that wasn't going to happen, I decided to leave.
And set up your own practice?
Yeah.
So David, you said that when you were at Kingston, your work was quite avant-garde, but then when you went to the AA, you were surrounded by so much avant-garde work that you almost went the other way. And some of the figures at the A at that time became leading figures in the deconstructivist movement. You worked with Norman Foster and Richard Rogers, who became very much associated with high tech and the use of glass and steel and structural elements. During those years, were you already forming your own approach to architecture? This sort of calmer, more austere, classical stroke modernist approach that you've become known for?
I mean, I was brought up on a heavy diet of good old-fashioned modernism, of Corbusier and Alto and Mies, and they were the heroes of the group that I was in, and people like Sue Rogers and David Chipperfield, and peripheral to that, John Miller and Ed Jones, figures like that were, in a way, trying to keep modernism alive. The big change was the arrival of postmodernism, and that was profound in the AA, I would say. Given that there were all these other things were going on, it was a moment of great pluralism. Charles Jenks arrived giving wonderful lectures about, a much more diverse attitude towards architecture and with a high level of critique of modernism. There was a wonderful exhibition of the Beaux-Arts and the AA, and I remember this amazing series of lectures, including Smithson's. Henry Russell Hitchcock came. So there was a real sense of change. The table had been overturned, and so conventional dogmas of modernism were really being challenged. And there was, in a way, in England, everybody at this point hated modern architecture because they'd only seen really bad versions of it. So this was both an intellectual and a popular rejection of modernism, and then everyone's scrambling to fill the void. And you had different groups. So you had postmodernists filling it with issues about history and re-looking at architects that had been, as it were, banned, Lutyens and Mackintosh, but even more, Labrouste and 19th century art. Then you had the high-tech bunch coming up with a very different sort of engineering-based, sort of performance-based architecture. And then you had a sort of rear guard of die-hard in-the-trench modernists who were determined that modernism was not really dead. And I suppose in that period, it was just a very interesting moment to go to the buffet. And of course, as a student, you're a little bit confused. I mean, it was a very confusing time. And so I was sort of interested in a wider and, more Catholic repertoire of architects beyond the standard modernist regime. I wasn't particularly interested in high tech, funny enough. I mean, that was probably the bit that I was least interested in some ways, although I had the opportunity to go to Paris and see Centre Pompidou during construction, and Richard took me around. I knew him at that point, and I just thought that was the sexiest building I'd ever seen in my life. I thought the whole process was just extraordinary, and to see architecture with that sort of power and, in a way, self-confidence and determination. And you couldn't help being impressed by what architecture could do. So in that sense, I was impressed by it. So yeah, it was a confusing time. I sort of came out of architecture school, having been trained in modernism, seduced by postmodernism, and then impressed by Pompidou Center and some of the early works of Rogers and Piano. So if I think of someone like Zaha, who was a colleague at the time, I mean, she came out very formed. I mean, in a way, Zaha knew what she wanted to do as a student, and it was a very straight line. I don't think for many of us it was quite so clear.
So how did you find your feet then? Once you'd set up your own practice, how did it evolve from there? How did you start to get work, and how did you approach those projects?
There's always a thing that when you sit in a large office, you become friendly with others, and then you spend 80% of your time working on projects and 20% of your time plotting your escape and working out, where you're going to go next and how you could start on your own. And so you end up in a lot of conversations with friends and colleagues. So Ken Armstrong was someone I had met who was a student at the Royal College, and we worked together at Norman Foster's. We decided we would dig a tunnel out, but we didn't have much work. In fact, I went out first and tried to set up, and I had done my own apartment, which we used as a sort of moonlighting office. And we tried to get work there, and Ken would come and work in the evenings, and we would do competitions and little sort of bathroom extensions. I mean, looking back, I don't know where one got the arrogance to imagine that you could start an office with absolutely nothing. I mean, it was a terrible period, worst time possible to go out. But then I managed to get an interview with the woman that ran the Issey Miyake shops in London, and they were looking for someone to design. And so she saw my apartment and and liked the apartment. So I got that project, which I did really, and it was a bit strange, coming from these big offices and then just doing a little shop in Sloane Street. But for our generation, our expectations were quite low, and so therefore one took it very seriously, and it was very well received. It was a time when shop design hadn't really started. Joseph had done a few with Eva Jarikna, and this was a sort of the first of the sort of design Japanese influence, minimalist interiors, and therefore it created a lot of tension in this poor environment where not much was going on, and so all of a sudden this looked quite interesting. And then Issey Miyake invited me to Japan, and so I worked there on lots of stores for him. This was 86, right in the middle of bubble time in Japan. And because of that, then by being there, I got work in Japan. So we built 3 small buildings in Japan, and that was enough to, in a way, substantiate the notion that we had an office, even if it was a bit tenuous.
And at that time, did you already have these ideas that architecture should be a tool to improve society, or were you just happy to have any work to work on?
Both. The struggle of young architects is we're not artists. We can't just sort of sit in a studio and self-generate work and then develop our ideas in blissful isolation, even if we're struggling and poor. But as architects, you depend on the commission. So you have to be opportunistic. And that's one of the problems for our profession. As a young architect, you're idealistic and opportunistic. And I think if you have an excess of one as over the other, then I think you're a bit lost. So the question is, how do you keep that balance of being opportunistic and being smart in terms of knowing how to follow up things, at the same time to keep a conviction of, how one was trained and what you believe architecture is about. And that it doesn't get any easier. I mean, that's the story from then on, is this balance between opportunism and idealism. And that's what has to drive you. And I think the Japan thing was an incredible experience for me, and it was a fork in the road that was fundamental to me, both in terms of influence, because I spent 3 or 4 years going backwards and forwards. I mean, I didn't live there, but I spent weeks at a time and every month for 4 or 5 years. I mean, every designer going to Japan is just seduced because it elevates things that we all believe are important. So this idea that normal things take on a sort of special quality, that the special is found in the normal, as opposed to the sort of design proliferation that was happening in Europe where everything became special. And I think this was really important for me on that sense, that I realized that you could reduce architecture. Ando was becoming the great star of modern architecture, and I was fortunate to become good friends with Isosaki. I became good friends with Ando, and Ando helped me with the second building. He saw the first building and then just shook his head and said, "You have to learn how to use concrete. I'll help you next time." And he did. So it was a great privilege to be in a culture. The second great lesson, I suppose, was the thing of building somewhere else in somebody else's culture and the anxiety that that brings with it. What right do you have in a country full of good architects? What right do you have to build there? It questions your sense of entitlement. If you're an architect, you come out of college with a sense of entitlement. And I'm an architect, so why isn't everybody knocking on my door and calling me up and saying they need me? So that period slightly changed one's sense that you realize that you weren't needed. And secondly, I would say by working in another culture, you felt like you were walking on eggshells because you sort of thought, well, what does this mean? Am I building an English building? Am I a British architect making a British building? Am I a British architect pretending to be a Japanese architect? What is my contribution? What am I giving to this that a Japanese architect couldn't do? And I would say that sort of survived. My feeling, that's how to enter every project, whether it's in your own city or not. I think when it's in your own culture, you take things much more for granted. When you build in Berlin, as an Englishman, you're dealing with German history. You're on some sort of stage that you've invented for yourself. In my opinion, you better think hard about how you take that fortune. You don't squander that extraordinary opportunity. And I would say, I suppose, because I've always worked abroad and never really worked in this country, I've always thought that every opportunity was really an opportunity and something that brought with it a great chance and a great privilege.
So how did you get from working in Japan to getting projects in Germany? Because that was the country after Japan that really took you on board and gave you a few projects.
Actually, I would say the next country was Italy, funny enough, because the country that could never be at that time was England. You sat in invented office trying to be an architect. You felt like you were an imposter because you had a sign on the door, but you had to invent your role. So we invented it out of shops in Paris or a project in Japan, and putting these things together into a sort of publications or something, a brochure that made you look like a real architect. But of course, it was sort of highly manipulated out of the bits and pieces. But of course, as an architect, what you really want to do is bigger buildings. So we survived by doing shops. shops for Miyake, shops for equipment, and a few others. That paid the bills, hundreds of them. Quick work, not bad fees, and paying the bills. But what we wanted to pretend to be is architects doing big buildings. So we did a lot of competitions. So we funded the competitions off of the shops and entered a lot of competitions in Italy because there were no competitions in England at the time. There was a sort of resurgence of competitions in Italy that time, end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, and we won about 4. It was a period where the Italians had decided to somehow wash out this sort of corruption in public projects. And there was a lot of very interesting competitions announced. We won the Venice Cemetery, Salerno Law Courts, and the museum in Milan. And for us, that was great because, we looked like architects all of a sudden. So the shop drawings sort of carried on, but at the same time, we could pin up, and we had big models of law courts and museums. So that was really important. The fact that we couldn't get them built was still in the process of all those 3. Well, the Milan Museum got finally finished 2 years ago. Salerno Law Courts has been in construction for 14 years. However, it was a step up. I mean, we couldn't have got the buildings we did in Japan, these sort of small, quite nice, manageable buildings. I couldn't have got them here. We couldn't have got public building competitions here. So that was Italy. Cumulatively, the way that we, I suppose, presented ourselves, we had some built work. We had very nice shop interiors. We built things. We had a few things in Japan being built. And then we had these competitions. And if you put them all in a sort of box to a cocktail, it looked like we were real architects. However, we looked across the channel with great envy to our colleagues in Switzerland or in France or in Germany who were running real offices. But that was the aspiration, I suppose. And I suppose the other thing that I forgot to include in this was the 9H experience. So when I opened the first office in Marylebone, we had been in my apartment. And then Dan Sujic called me one day and said that he was opening this magazine called Blueprint. They'd taken a building in Kramer Street in Marylebone, and that they were going to take the top 2 floors. Sebastian Conran was going to take the middle, but would I be interested in taking the ground floor? So this was a huge jump and decision, and I decided to do it. And we had extra space. And Wilfred Wang and Ricky Burdett, they were running the magazine 9H. And I said, why don't we do some exhibitions? Because I had been helping on some exhibitions in the RIBA and trying to get an exhibition of Renzo Piano, and it was just impossible with the RIBA. So that's what we did, and so we ran 9H Gallery for 2 or 3 years in the office, and for us it was fantastic. 1 month we'd have the drawings of Alvaro Siza on the wall, the next we would have Tado Ando, the next we would have Renzo Piano. In fact, I was in Renzo Piano's office last week, and they reminded me that the first exhibition they ever had in England was in 9H Gallery. So that was also another way out of a rather provincial London scene. And in a way, I suppose, reminded one of there's nothing more inspiring than having Alvaro Siza in your office, when you've just started your own practice, to pick Isozaki up at the airport. I suppose from the beginning, there was a strong cultural emphasis in the office. We linked up with a magazine called Quaderns in Barcelona, who were our contemporaries. Luis Mateo, Eduard Bru, people like that, who were my generation, really good architects in Barcelona. They came to London, they did a big presentation in my apartment and showed the work of Barcelona architects. In fact, that's how 9H slightly started, because it started with a sort of party in my house where these Barcelona architects were talking about architecture. So I would say I've always tried to maintain the profile of cultural dimensions of architecture within the daily slog of the professional commercial practice. And that's been something important. So, it's really weird looking back over these years because it sort of looks reasonably sensible now, but it certainly didn't on the way up. It was very much hit and miss and duck and dive and wiggling around. But I suppose there was always the sense of being an outsider, I guess, strangely, that, being in other countries, not because I didn't want to work here, but because the opportunities. One had to pick up sticks and go to other places to find that work. And then after Italy, Germany became the next chance.
And you've mentioned a few times how you felt like you were putting on a front to try and give the impression that you had a coherent architecture office. Do you feel like you've made it now, or do you still feel a little bit like there's something missing or there's somewhere more to go?
No, I still feel like a sham. I still feel like I've cobbled together something that aspires to being a sort of grown-up architect. You go to Renzo's office and you just think, I was impressed and depressed at the same time, because you think, well, this is a real grown-up office, And I've had to cobble it together, I guess. It's a different way of operating. I think, I've had to keep moving. And I'm not a talented figure like Renzo. I'm a good catalyst. I think I'm a good provoker. I think I'm a good strategist. I think I have a certain sense of purpose, maybe. But I don't have innate creative talents to the level someone like Renzo does, or maybe Frank Gehry, Alvaro Siza, or intellectual talents like Rem Koolhaas or Rafael Moneo. So in that sense, yeah, I feel a bit of a fake.
Do you still feel a little bit like the schoolboy who has to train a bit more than everyone else to win the race?
Yeah, and slightly aware that it's effort that's got me here more than talent, and that maybe that's what keeps motivating. On the other hand, I would say probably I've never lost that sense of being frightened of entitlement. Given I had no expectations, I'm more than happy with where I sit and more than content with the challenges that we have, and I have no right to expect anything more than what I have.
It hasn't turned out too bad.
Well, I've been incredibly fortunate. My wife would always say, yes, but you have to make your luck as well, or she calls it fortune, not luck. I think that given that sense that one is lucky, then one shouldn't abuse that, or at least one should optimize that. I'm terrified of the notion that you don't take full advantage. And I think that's why I do Domus, that's why I do Biennale, that's why I have a foundation in Galicia where we're working a lot on supporting the government in planning and programs of environmental protection and working with food production, working with all sorts of things, which is a huge amount of work. But I feel motivated to do it because, I think there's payback time. And I think, as I was saying before, I think that, when you're younger, you have no power, you have no authority, and you've got lots of ideas. If you've got the ear of people and you can actually have an influence, then, that's the time to do it. There is a paradox in one's life, at the time when you've got most energy and, you want to do most, you've got less power. It's a bit like bringing up kids, I wish one could have kids when you're later, because at that point you've got your career sorted out and you've got maybe a bit of money in the bank. You have your kids when you're struggling with everything else. You've got everything else to work out all at the same time. Why can't we have kids when we're like 65? I guess I'm as motivated now as I've ever been. And I suppose there is this weird condition that just as I'm getting used to driving the bus, we're going off the track. All of a sudden the landscape, I'm looking out of the bus window and thinking, what the hell's going on out there? And I was in Berlin giving a lecture to the office the day before yesterday, saying I think this is an incredibly exciting period because I think more than ever we are valuable. We've been giving value to property in the last 30 years. I mean, we're lucky, I would say, as an office because we've been working on museums, a lot of public work. So we could a little bit excuse ourselves a bit more in our complicity into the whole system by saying, yeah, but we're trying to do museums, okay. And of course, those projects have some societal purpose. And I would say Berlin, also in the reconstruction projects, there's a certain purpose. But of course we do other things, which are expensive apartments in Kensington, which you're trying to do good architecture, but of course the whole delivery is overinflated real estate, and your purpose is to help inflate, which I don't think is the happiest position for architects to be in. But that's actually a position that we increasingly in the Anglo-Saxon world, nearly exclusively, is our role. So we used to work for common good, and now we work for the market. So I think that this crisis is forcing everybody to rethink things that we fundamentally believe. We fundamentally believe that the built environment contributes to quality of life and, dare I say it, happiness. It can't put education or food on your plate or medicine, But it is a safety net in terms of your quality of life, that if you've got a nice place to live and if you've got a nice community and if you've got a nice school to take your kids to and and a nice park and a nice streets, well, we know that's a good start. And if we've neglected that, which is what we have in this country and what is being now explicitly put on the table, that it's not only making people's lives miserable, it's actually even affecting their health, then I think it's time that we stood up and said, well, we've always known that, pushing that harder again.
You say it's time to stand up and say that, but are you planning to do something? Are you going to make a speech or do a TV program, or what is your intervention? It sounds like you're building up to some kind of statement.
Building up to, just getting a grumpy old man. Well, Domus, I'm writing an editorial in every Domus, which, the first one was about planning, the second one is about social housing, the third is about reuse and memory. The next one's going to be shelter, the importance of shelter. 50% of the world's urban population is living in temporary housing. We have 7 million people in poverty in this country. Every newspaper you pick up should have the top heading should be 7 million people in poverty in the UK. We're not talking about India or something. I'm using the foundation in Galicia to work with the government towards the idea that I believe that Galicia could be the first totally sustainable region of Europe. This is a goal that we're committed to and we're pushing, and we're being used as an agency, and on a daily basis we're getting calls to help, and it's an extremely exciting commitment and project. It is, and I keep talking about it a lot in the office, the things that we do which are in a way most societally valuable are the pro bono things that are not part of our professional employment. So what we're doing is we're cheating a bit. We're running an office. Through the office, I'm using some of my resources to do things like DOMAS, to do other projects. I did this research program on planning using the Rolex mentorship, and did an analysis of the whole Bishopsgate planning fiasco, which I think had some effect. But yeah, it's very difficult to change things. But I think as an elder statesman of the profession, then it's my responsibility to be as irritating as I possibly can. I mean, I stood up a lot for Brexit as much as I could.
Against Brexit, not for Brexit.
Yeah, totally. And trying to embarrass the profession for not standing up more. Why the RIBA didn't take a position. I mean, I challenged them continuously to take a position, and they wouldn't, which I think is preposterous, because we know this is all about deregulation. And as architects, we know the consequence of deregulating. We know it. That's our front line. So why we didn't make a huge stand? I mean, okay, who's going to listen to architects? I think we could have instigated an opposition. But I think architects have just forgotten how to be engaged. And it's surprising how many times people say to me, but why are you so grumpy about this? Why are you complaining all the time? You're in a good position. Yeah, but that's why I can complain. I'm not complaining for myself. I'm complaining for others. Your question is, what am I doing about all this grumpiness? I don't give lectures about my work. I give lectures about the role of the architect. I was just in Mendrisio. There were 1,300 students, and I spent 15 minutes on the work of the office and an hour on the role of the architect, the role of profession, the responsibility of profession. I showed the agendas we've got for DOMAS, and I talked about the foundation in Galicia and showed what we're doing there, which is we're working with the expertise of architects and planners, but not on architecture, working on the whole idea of the issues that make up a good community and quality of life, which are the things which I think are important.
What do you think of this opinion of people that say, well, if you believe in fighting climate change, why do architects design airports? If you believe in equality, why would you take on a luxury apartment building?
Yes, they're right. We're in no easier position than the rest of us. I mean, as individuals in our houses, if we turn the mirror on ourselves, say, so what? Come on, what are we doing? Have we done anything in our house to help the situation? And of course, we all sort of say, yeah, well, we're all thinking about. It's not much easier as a professional to suddenly say we're not going to do this type of project. It's very difficult to know where you draw the line on these things. But of course, there are some things which I think would be fairly easily. But it's the same thing with regimes. Should you work for certain regimes that you don't believe in? On the other hand, if I would have thought that culture is a bridge. Therefore, I would be much happier if we could be more engaged in projects which have more purpose. We should all be working on social housing, but if there isn't any social housing, it's very difficult. But the truth is, we shouldn't probably be doing towers. We're so far down the food chain that by the time things get to us, the big damage has been done. If all we're doing is fiddling around with window frames and thermal performance of a building, perhaps, and this is the issue of planning, we should have been further upstream to say, well, actually, the buildings should have been 5-story, not 25 stories. They should have been closer to a community, some sort of hub, so that people don't have to get in their car every time they want to go take their kids to school or go and pick up groceries. There are logics which are more complex and much more important, and that's why we have to regain the whole idea of planning, as opposed to being architects that just put facades on a predetermined real estate project. You're given a site, there's a red line, that's the number of square meters, this is the brief, and work it out. And essentially, you're not going to make any change whatsoever to the challenges, either social or in terms of resource, when you come in at that point.
Finally, earlier on in the interview, you gave a list of all the things that you're not particularly good at, but you said that when you were young, you were good at art. And I wanted to ask you, how do you approach architecture? Do you sketch? Do you make models? In terms of the craft of architecture and the kind of creative bit of architecture, how do you do it?
Interestingly, there's a lot of architects that really can't draw at all. And, there are others which do a lot of drawings. Renzo Piano does a lot of drawings. Norman Foster does a lot of drawings. I think Frank Gehry does a lot. But, I'm not sure to what degree they are instrumental in the design process always, but clearly some more than others. And some of them are precise and some of them are evocative. As architects, we all draw to some degree because it's a way of us explaining decisions. And I believe that drawings are a discipline, but the question of the sort of personal drawing in terms of the sketch and the role of someone like me in an office, to what degree do they sketch as part of the process? I would say less and less is the architect's drawing the generating instrumental device. However, I would sketch, for instance, through a process and react to things with sketches. There's very few projects where I could look back and show you a sketch and say, oh, look how the sketch turned into a building. I can find some things where those moments happen, but mostly it's part of process. I think there's two things implicit in this. To what degree do drawing and making models contribute to the process generally? And secondly, I guess, to what degree do these become determining tools? Of course, we are using drawings and of all sorts, whether they're working drawings or plans. So we are continuously working with some sort of drawing. But we are not artists in the sense that we can never complete something. We can't give something any completeness through drawing. The only moment of completion is the building. And everything up until then is a tool. And some architects would argue that everything up until then is irrelevant and can be chucked in the bin. It's only the building that you require, and that's partly true. Architecture and art overlap a lot. We are inspired by similar things, but we are not artists and we can't operate like artists. But it is interesting to think about how do drawings and images contribute. I would say one of the big frustrations is that because we can do computer-generated images now, there is an expectation from clients that we can show what a building is going to be like from the beginning. And to some degree, that short circuits the drawing as a device. Because why would you need to present a project through drawing if in the very first presentations, the architect is forced, even at competition level, to show what the building would look like. Without showing that, you don't get commissioned. So there's a sort of weird thing. Whereas in the past, the beginning of this journey of developing a project, the initial sketches and ideas will be quite vague. Well, a computer-generated image can't be vague. It ends up being extremely specific to the point at which, you end up with clients after competition saying, well, we like it a lot. We're just nervous about the dark wood in the auditorium. You say, yeah, hang on, we haven't even designed the auditorium yet. Oh, so you wouldn't necessarily use dark wood? I said, no. So why did you put dark wood? Well, because in a computer-generated image, you've got to choose a button, dark wood, light wood, or something else. There are decisions that you don't want to have to make at that point. You're not ready to make them. But the formulation, precision of this type of drawing forces you. And I think that, short circuits another tradition, which was the speculation of a building and the imagery of a building through tentative methods of drawing and sketching and rendering. And that seems to me a shame. And it's something we talk about a lot as to whether we could pull back from that. And of course, there are certain clients that don't need those types of drawings and others that do. And some architects just refuse to do them. Again, going to see different architects, quite interesting. I would say Renzo Piano doesn't do that many of those. He does manage to communicate most of the things through drawings and models, which is a little bit old-fashioned, but increasingly clients want to take risk away in every way. So even the risk of decision-making. So in order for a committee of people to decide whether they want to choose this project, they want to know what it's going to look like. Yeah, if I was a client, maybe I want to do that, but as an architect, that's a big problem because we're being asked to put the food on the plate before we've cooked it. And that short circuits the whole journey in a way because one would like the idea that the building concept formulates. And it's putting a lot of pressure on what buildings look like instead of what buildings, how they should evolve. And certainly from our point of view, I would say one of the most exciting projects we ever did was the Noise Museum because we never really said what it was going to be like. It was just an idea that we wanted to protect the ruin, to complete it, and somehow bring it all together. There were no computer-generated images. There was no real project formulated totally. And it was accepted. That was a strong enough idea. And the project would generate itself through the process. And it did. We had no idea where it would end. But that's easier when there's already a ruin to work in because everyone knew what the Noise Museum looked like. As an architect, it's a bit of a shame when the fun of drawing and the fun of exploration is somehow cut away by this desire for everybody to know what it looks like from the beginning.
David, thank you very much.
You're more than welcome.
Thanks for listening. This podcast was sponsored by Twinmotion and produced by our in-house creative team, Dezeen Studio, with music by Yuri Suzuki from Pentagram. To find out more, go to dezeen.com/podcasts. You can keep up to date on past and future episodes of Face to Face by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify.